But I'm also trying to
You good to go?
just something like a block.
All right. Welcome, everybody. It's meeting 100. Yay. Thank you. We're going to do some cool stuff with vulnerability scanning, and it's canned in a Docker image. So if you're new, please come to the check out our committees. We're absolutely looking for new members. If you're interested in getting involved, we have 6 of them, so there's lots of variety. And a couple announcements before we get started. Same ones as last week, pretty much. But Mason High School Hack Club, we're visiting them again 2 more times. The NSA Codebreaker Challenge starts in 2 days, I believe. And we'll be doing that as a club at some point in the next, probably it'll be next week, but that goes on for around 3 months. Northrop Grumman recruitment event is going on next week on Tuesday, right before the career fair. So if you want to go apply there, that's the place. We'll have more details about that in Slack. Battelle visit is scheduled for next week. So if you guys want to see some really cool stuff with fuzzing and with AFL Unicorn, which is something that someone at Battelle wrote, we're going to do that next week. And also you can ask Aaron to review resumes, and he works over there. So that'll be pretty exciting. Pico CTF is after that. Then GE Aviation, we're going to visit their SOC over there, and the NSA is going to come around in October. So lots of events coming up. This is a slide from Mike, but Battelle, again, they're coming next week. Bring your resumes, bring laptops, and we're going to have food. All right.
It's me.
Hey guys, I'm gonna go over some weekly news in the cyber realm. Where's the band-aids? No one gets that joke. It's because you put band-aids over your webcam. So recently, I forget the name of the company, but they came out and said that 15,000 private webcams were vulnerable to exploitation. Pretty much the cause of this was that manufacturers just really try to streamline the installation process of their webcams, so they just leave the configuration of the webcam to like default settings with no security on them. So it's just like open ports and no authentication, so you just plug and play. It's extremely dangerous. Some dangerous things about that is they're worried companies can steal intellectual property by just like hacking into a conference room webcam and just listening to an entire meeting. Also, increased crime rate with children at home. So you just like open up a webcam and say, like, hey, Johnny's home alone, let's break in. Then also criminals could manipulate webcam footage. I thought this was really interesting. I didn't think of this. But say you rob a bank and you have access to their webcams, you can just like wipe that footage and then you're good. Panda crypto mining. So Panda, aka China, they've been crypto mining lately with some malware. So it started last year mainly with Mass Miner, but they've kind of been just chugging away till now. They basically use web vulnerabilities to install crypto mining malware. They've updated their infrastructure and payloads, so I thought this was really weird, but they pulled down a file called BBBBB instead of like a random 20 character file name. Somehow that's made the news. But they pull that file down and then execute it in PowerShell. And they've also used certutil, which is a Windows utility for just certificate management and checking. So they mess with that and then pull down a second miner so they can start mining, I think, another currency and or just have 2 miners running at the same time. And someone else also mentioned that they're extremely lazy. They just keep attacking the same targets over and over again with the same exact attacks, and they don't even really check if the system is vulnerable. They just like throw it at it and call it a day. So there's that. Cam Scanner, if anyone has this app, you should probably delete it and or update it.
I had it and Google gave me a notification that it's using ad fraud.
Yeah. So basically, Kaspersky reverse engineered this app or just looked at the code and they were like, hey, there's some adware in here. So basically, it was a piece of malware that would just like show ads to the user or steal their credentials. Nothing too fancy, but Kaspersky said it was a legitimate app and somehow someone just like injected their malware into it. They weren't really clear on how they did that or why, but they just said the app was legitimate. And then this was also just part of an increase in apps on the Google Play Store having malware injected into them. But that's really all I have this week for news.
All right, so our main content this week is going over the basics of Docker and then using it to deploy OpenVAS. OpenVAS is the Open Vulnerability Assessment Scanner. And it's basically a tool that you deploy on a network, and you say scan all these machines, and it goes through and it tries to look for ways it can attack those machines according to a database of known attacks. And if it finds something interesting, it tells you, although their web UI isn't super great. So here's our agenda. If you weren't here last week, we'll go over briefly what we did. There's some stuff to know before we get into it. And then we'll go over installing Docker, how to use it, and then how to use it with OpenVAS and Metasploit. So, if you weren't here last week, shame on you again. What we went over was the basic Linux commands. So if you want another source to go over pretty much the same content, Over the Wire has a challenge called Bandit that you can SSH into from any box on the internet. And it's got most of what we went over, although it's severely less helpful because it's just like, you might find these commands helpful, and it expects you to like solve challenges without any other context. So yeah, today we'll require our previous Debian VM, so we set that up 2 weeks ago. You guys remember? Yes, okay, someone nodded. Yeah, and you can do this on Windows, but Docker's a pain in the ass to install on Windows, so we're going to do it on Debian today because it's super fast. Also, Docker uses a lot of disk space if you're not really paying attention to it. So the way containers work is you pull a like bare bones version of the like the image that you're going to run, and then every time you start one, you copy it. If you're not paying attention, you can start a bunch of them, and then you can also have a bunch of images that you've like saved locally, like prop up, and like each one can run from like half a gig to like maybe 5 gigs. You just gotta go through and clear those every now and then. So also OpenVAS and Metasploit, if you use them, you can do malicious things, so don't be stupid. We don't condone doing either of those or malicious things as a club. So we're going to just do everything today as root because it's going to be way easier to install, which means if you rmrf/, you will delete everything on your VM's hard drive. So don't do that. Yeah.
I think they actually added a root protection flag specifically for that command.
Yeah, there's
you have to do like -- no root protection.
No preserve root.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can do it, but they don't want you to. So installing Docker, everyone go ahead and open up your virtual machines. I'll actually pop out of here real quick. Present, sorry. If we go to VirtualBox, we can open our Debian machines from 2 weeks ago. I should have done this beforehand. I'll wait for that. So the process is actually pretty simple. You just have to download the web page at get.docker.com. You can do that through the command line utility wget, which stands for webget, which is basically...
Debian's being a little, actually not just use Kali.
Yeah. Actually, no, you can't use Kali. Kali does not work with this.
We have a patch for that script on the Slack.
Okay, if you go to our, what is it, CTF?
Where'd you put that? Yeah.
In the Slack, if you go to the CTF channel, there should be a fixed version of the script for Kali. So basically, if you do wget.docker.com, it'll download to your current directory the index.html file, which is just the bare bones of the website. And then you can just rename it to be a shell script, and then just run that as root, and it will install Docker for you. It's pretty nice. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Oh, yeah, it's white. No. I gotta fix that real quick. Alright, cool. So. So if we wget get.docker.com, we get the index.html file. We can just move that to be install docker.sh. Really whatever you want as long as it's called sh. Oop. Thanks. And then Sue will give you a command prompt as admin. You just type in your password and it won't show you. That's pretty standard for Linux. And then as root, which is the admin on Linux distributions, use sh as shell script run, and then install docker.sh. And then, oh, there's an error. All right.
Chris, if people are running Ubuntu, what should they do to get root?
Sudo is what you do on Ubuntu, so I don't actually have the setup on this one. You just do sudo and then sh install, and that will just run the single command as admin. It will also prompt you for your user password, but if you want to do a just like shell as sudo, which will be a lot nicer, you can do sudo se for shell and then save your environmental variables so you actually have color left on your terminal. So I'm just waiting for whatever's got a handle on. All right. What the heck? Cool. All right, so once you can actually do apt update just on your system, that means nothing else is trying to update software currently, so you can safely run the install script. Oh no. Who's got that? I should have done this before. All right, so another thing with package managers is, as you can currently see, another service is trying to update software in the background for me. That keeps you from doing any kind of software installation on the app, at least. Does Pacman do that?
Yeah, Pacman does that too.
So most package managers will have what's called a lock file. So if you can't like exclusively use this lock file in your current process, it'll keep you from doing anything with the package manager. Let's see if that actually fixed it. Hopefully. Okay, so that worked. So what that's going to do is it's going to go through and add the actual like Docker Debian repository to our apt sources, which just lets it know that lets the system know that we can download software updates from that location. That's just a URL on the internet with some fancy formatting for apt to look at. And then it's going to try to remove existing versions of Docker and then install the Docker CE, which is like the current stable community edition. Is anyone having trouble with this? Awesome. Oh no. So back to the slides. While that chugs away, it takes a little bit, like not usually longer than 2 minutes. What is Docker? So Docker is an open source commercial container engine. Containers are basically like OS level only virtualization. So whereas virtual machines encapsulate an entire machine through software, including like simulating all the hardware, OS level virtualization only does it from the software layer. So this means that you share all of your hardware with your host machine, which actually leads to a lot of security vulnerabilities with Docker. There are actually containers that all they do is when you download them, they try to break out of the Docker environment and get a shell on your host machine. It's actually really funny to watch. Docker Hub is a website with a bunch of pre-made containers, so as we install this, which is not quite done yet. Nope. Did you freeze? All right, it's taking a while. So we can go through and we can do Docker search and then type in the name of the program we want to find and use immediately. And then the Docker Hub website will give us a list of like interesting things prioritized by how many people have starred them. So it's kind of like a trust-based system. Although there are a lot of base images on there for like very simple OSs like Ubuntu. You can get like a super mini version of it. And then there's like the official Docker user is called base. So if you find anything in base, that's like Docker made. But if you find the official version, it's usually like Canonical Group Ubuntu, because that's the company that runs Ubuntu. Yeah, and then most major OSs are available on Docker through Docker Hub. So I actually, this install. So after that's done, you probably just want to stay at root because we're not going to bother with configuring the Linux permissions. That's a little bit above the scope of this, and you have to restart your machine. So once you have everything ready, you should be able to run Docker PS. That will show you all your running containers, which of course we've just installed it, so it's none. So we can do Docker run hello world. It'll say, I can't find this machine locally, so it goes out to Docker Hub and downloads it. And then it shows us this fun image and then kills itself. So.
What was the command you just read?
The command was just Docker run hello world. So the Docker run command, obviously the Docker program, and then run as a subcommand. Usually it's the last term on it is your machine, or you can have another machine or another term after that, which is the command you want to run on the machine. So if we do Docker search, let's not do Ubuntu, like Alpine. Well, Alpine's a super tiny Linux version. Try that again. Oh no. Okay, it's just called Alpine. So we can do Docker run, and then if we want to attach interactive with a machine as if we like SSH into it, we can do IT for interactive and then allocate a terminal. And then if we want to get rid of it as soon as it's done running, we can do RM at the end of it, and then we can just do Alpine, and then we want to run the bash command. So I think Alpine has bash. Let's find out. Oh no. Oh no. Alright, let's type it Alpine. So it'll pull down the entire file system. It'll run it. Oh no. Exec bash. Okay, so there's no bash program on Alpine, so it's probably just SH. And these are just the terminal programs that are running. So now I'm entirely inside this Docker container. If I do ls, I'm actually in a different location than for my Debian machine. So it's pretty nice. If I control D out of that or exit, it'll kill it. And if I do PSA, because we gave it that hyphen, well, not PSA, Docker PSA, thirsty gates. We can see that Alpine image actually isn't there anymore because it was deleted. We can see our containers have an ID, the image, like the base image they run from, which was hello world for this previous one. The command is /hello, which is just a quick Docker check. Another interesting thing is Docker has friendly names for all the machines that are usually just two random words shoved together. So this one was thirsty gates. So they're usually not that fun, but interesting. So where is Docker used? It's used in a lot of places, from development all the way to production environments. So if you're doing things in development like GitLab CI, which we actually use for our, disconnect from that. Come back. So our own custom projects that we make for CyberUC, we are currently using GitLab CI for most of those. So basically you can define a file that just looks like this, so it's just a bunch of scripts basically back to back. And every time you push your Git code to source, it'll run all of these commands on it, on like a new Docker image every single time, and make sure they actually run. So you can do things like make sure all your code compiles, make sure all the logic runs. Super useful. You can also use it to deploy full production environments. So we'll be using it for OpenVAS today. Basically, someone installed the OpenVAS web app on a container and then packaged that and threw it on Docker Hub. So we don't have to spend like an hour setting up this web app. We can just pull the machine. So Google also runs, quote, billions of containers every week. They probably don't run billions actively. They probably kill a bunch and start new ones continuously. So there's a system called Kubernetes, which they created, that lets you run a huge number of containers. So here's the command rundown. Docker run hello world, where did that, so that'll make sure that we can actually run basic containers. Docker search, you may have seen me do that just now. Docker search, Alpine gave us a huge list of things. So we can do more specific things like Docker search Kali. It's too small. There actually is a official Kali Linux Docker image, which when you download it doesn't have like any of the tools installed on it, but you can use the Kali meta packages to deploy pretty much any tool instantaneously. So if you're doing a class that requires Kali, that's usually pretty useful. Docker start. Oh. Uh-oh. It broke. Okay, it's back. So Docker start and Docker stop. If you have containers that are running persistently, like web apps, you can usually just stop and restart them as you need. Start also has a couple flags like AI, which lets you reattach with a terminal. Docker exec, so if you have a running container, such as a web app, and you want to open a bash session on it, you can. So actually, I'm going to leave my VM for now and go back to my host machine. So I have several containers. I have OpenVAS already deployed, so we'll do that in a little bit. But that is, it's not running right now, but I can do Docker start and then call it by its name, OpenVAS. And that usually takes a few minutes the first time you run it, but now that I've already done it, it's pretty fast. So if I want to open a shell on that, I can just do Docker exec, what is this command? DI, no, not DI. Interactive? IT. Yeah, IT. So that's for interactive, and then it was TTY for teletype terminal. So it basically like actually wraps what you're doing in a terminal just so it displays a lot nicer. And then, oh man, there's not bash. What? Oh. Uh-huh. So I can open bash on the container as if I just SSH into it, but it's not quite the same thing because it just reaches straight into the Docker container environment. So now I'm on the OpenVAS box, as you can see by the OpenVAS check setup. So there's all kinds of fun commands. There's like 80 total commands. If you just do Docker, it prints out a bunch. Uh-oh. This is most of the ones that you'll ever use are right here in the top few, but there are a whole bunch. So Docker is actually cool. So it's not just for microservice web apps. You can actually use it to deploy really fun offensive security applications. So because you can have like any Linux application and you don't have to build it from source, and it just like comes with this whole environment that runs with it. It's a lot nicer to deploy like full web apps. So Metasploit has like the database dependency. So if you want to use Metasploit, there is a Docker container for it. So Docker search Metasploit. So whereas you would have to previously, this is the real one, or you would have to previously spend like an hour setting up the Metasploit framework in its database, you can just pull the Docker container every single time you wanted to start a new instance of it, or you can just start one and then save it for later. So,
quick question: how many of you guys have heard of Metasploit?
Okay, no one's heard of Metasploit. Oh, everyone's heard of Metasploit. Okay.
Okay. For those of you that have not heard of it, Metasploit is part of a framework, the Metasploit framework, which is one of the most used tools in penetration testing today. It has a bunch of canned exploits and a really nice interactive interface, so you can point it at a machine, say, I want to use this exploit found in this year or made in this year against this type of protocol, and you can search for exploits and launch them on machines fairly easily with almost no groundwork of having to write the exploit yourself, which is huge. And it comes with a massive database filled with exploits.
Yeah, so Metasploit actually has something like, what, 16,000 exploits now?
Yeah.
And then like all these kinds of encoders. So you basically have a plug and play interface to hack other machines. It's really like canned, but it does a lot of stuff. So that is like usually not a trivial thing to set up on a fresh box. But if you can just download the whole machine it's running on and then start it, it's a lot nicer.
Yeah, I can say from experience, it's a huge hassle because you have to set up this really massive database, set up multiple user accounts, and hope that you haven't messed anything up by installing it as root instead of the right account. It's just it's a big hassle.
Yeah. Docker is also decently friendly to legacy applications. So if you have a piece of native code and you're like, I don't have a Docker file for this, you can just start a Docker image, dump it into that, and then save that image and upload it to, maybe not Docker Hub if you're doing it for like an internal company system, but you can export that, it's called an image, to other machines to run. So the OpenVAS container is pretty easy to set up. It seems like the accepted OpenVAS container is from an account called MikeSplain. So Docker definitely has this weird attack vector where if you're not sure what you're downloading, you might download malware. So it's a good thing to like go through the Docker Hub and make sure like what you're downloading is like real. So you guys can punch in this command. It'll start the OpenVAS instance on port 443, which is HTTPS. So after it sets up, it should eventually be able to be logged into. So I'll start a new one over here. What's that? Docker run. So Docker containers, you can also map your port inside your container directly to your host machine. So you could theoretically use these with virtual machines to deploy a lot of applications very quickly. So -P443443 reaches into the container and takes its port 443 and maps it to my host machine 443. So name OpenVAS 2. So that one didn't attach to the terminal because we ran it with D, which is detached, versus with I and T, which is interactive terminal. We would open that in a terminal. So we can do Docker PS to watch it run. We can see, we can see it's only been up a few seconds, so it's still starting. Usually gives us a status. Okay. So if we open our browser and go to localhost, really just HTTPS, localhost, it'll give us a connection is not private warning. It's just because it's using a custom SSL cert. There is a way with this container to feed it custom certs and also change the default admin password. So if you're doing this in like a production environment or on the internet, you definitely want to do that. But for our use on our local laptops, it's not a huge deal. So admin. When you first get to the screen, the login is admin, or should be. It might time out because the container might not have fully started in the background. Usually when you start a web app, especially something with a bunch of vulnerabilities on it, it has to go out to the internet and download the database of vulnerabilities again. So it takes a while. Even though the web app looks like it might be working, it usually takes a minute. Yeah.
That Docker image has to finish downloading first before I can open that, right?
What?
Yeah. Videos.
Yeah, the image, you have to download it from Docker Hub when you just do a run. It should automatically do that for you. So if you run, it's still downloading?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll slow down a little bit then. Yeah, I already had one cached, so it was already there. So you can also Docker images. Will show you all the images you currently have downloaded with their size. So you can see I'm somewhere in like the 20 to 30 gigabytes range just with like 10 images. What's on here?
How large is that container?
How long is what?
How large is the container in the camera?
OpenVAS is 7 gigabytes.
Damn, yeah.
Okay, so that one might not work.
Mine ran out.
You can Control C that and it should safely stop downloading.
No, I just have to inform you because I got no space left.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, hence the warning at the beginning. So, yeah, let's see. What else is good on here? Where did Metasploit go?
MSF is.
So Metasploit's only like half a gigabyte if you want to do that. It's Metasploit framework, Metasploit -framework. So that's another fun one to do. I'll kind of continue with the OpenVAS one. This one looks to be sad because it's a fresh Docker container. But So another thing is your Docker container has its own, Docker containers have their own virtual network that is kind of similar to a VirtualBox NAT only network. So it's basically looking at your main computer as a router and then having its own network inside of that. I think all the containers can talk to each other. So if we do docker exec it bash openvaz bash, we can see what their IP is usually on that network. So on this particular image, I did not forward it to my local machine because I had the other one sitting there. So I'll have to go to it. This is just one I've already set up, so we don't have to wait for the whole database of CVEs to download to like the multiple gigabytes that it usually is. So this is what the OpenVaz dashboard looks like. I've already done some scans. It's not a terribly nice look at dashboard, but up in scans, you can usually go to somewhere. Scans, tasks. There's a tiny button somewhere. Over here on the left, there's a button called Task Wizard. You might not be able to see that in the back. Oh no. So this little purple button called Task Wizard brings down the Task Wizard. So this nice woman, and we can just say, what's my IP address? So my IP address for my host machine on the Docker network is 172.17.01, so we'll just scan that, which it looks like that was the last one I scanned, so we'll just punch that back in. It's not exactly a brief process to go through every single port on a machine and then make sure in this huge database it's not vulnerable, but there's new updates to this every day, so you never know. So this kind of rolls us into vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities are basically just excuse me, are basically just canned software exploits that people have found. So CVE. CVE stands for Common Vulnerability Exposure and Exposures. So the authoritative website is cve.miter.org. MITRE is also the same nonprofit that runs the attack website, which is attack.miter.org. So they have a just gigantic CVE list of everything people reported to them. So you can go in here and just type in Windows 10, and you hit enter. They're usually categorized by date and severity. So the severity ranges from 1 being someone can learn some weird OS information about you that might let them, find out what your machine's running, to 10 being someone can run code on your machine as admin across the internet without you ever knowing, without any kind of password prompt, just So there's been very few 10s recently, but those are usually the ones you hear about in the news. So let's see. You can see they're usually a bunch that look identical in the description. It's because security researchers will just find a dozen at a time and then throw them all at CVEs. So, do you have anything to add, Cliff?
No, that's about it.
So they're usually pretty detailed. Every now and then you might see some that have example code. Usually you don't. So this one says there's a vulnerability in the Windows Jet database engine that improperly handles objects in memory. So this is one that describes a code execution through user input, which is pretty common. Let's see. Is there a category in this? Severity. I guess not. So, does CV MITRE have severities on it?
I don't know.
Okay.
Do you want to take a look at Bluekeep or something?
Yeah. So Bluekeep is a very recent popular one that came out. So Bluekeep is a remote, attack that you can do on Windows machines. Actually, let's do Eternal Blue.
Okay.
So Eternal Blue is similar to Bluekeep, but it came out 2 years ago. I bring that up because there is a Metasploit module for it that I don't know how to use. So Eternal Blue basically lets you connect to a Windows machine that has file sharing enabled, and then you can just run code on that machine. So if we wanted to exploit that and we knew a machine had that through Docker, we could, let's see, Docker PSA. I could say Docker start AI. Metasploit. Oh no.
If any of you guys remember WannaCry a few years ago, Eternal Blue was the exploit used to propagate that.
Yeah, so I can start a container that has Metasploit already loaded onto it. So, console?
Yep.
Oh, it's out of date. Yeah, so security is always changing, so the Metasploit console actually warns you if you haven't updated it for more than 2 weeks, because that's considered super out of date. And then you get a fun animation when it starts loading. Yeah, so if you've never seen Metasploit before, this is what the console version of it looks like. Is a UI called Armitage, which just basically sits directly on top of it, reaches into the code and runs it directly. So there's probably, we're up to 2,000 exploits if I were to update right now. There's all kinds of payloads. So
those are only the recent ones. Most of the database just doesn't come with it by default.
yeah, I think I updated this not recently.
They also changed how you update it and download all the exploits.
Cool. So, does it help? Search. Eternal Blue. So if you know the name of an exploit, if it has a common name, or maybe if it has a CV number attached to it, you can do like search and then the name of that attack, and then you can, through Metasploit, load it and throw it at a machine. So these are all things that we go back to OpenVaz. As OpenVaz scans a machine, it tries to categorize what's on there. So I actually have already finished a scan of my machine last week, or September 4th, 2 weeks ago. Yeah. So I can click on that, and then it will tell me if there's anything it detected on my machine at all. So, reports 1. UI kind of takes a little bit of looking at to get around. So there was one total like alert for my computer, and it was considered a low priority. So if we look at what that was, this one, yeah. Yeah. So it had a severity of 2.6, which is not considered high at all. How do we get in here? Monday. Oh no. Oh, results. Yeah.
Can you explain a little more of what a container is? Like what's actually running inside it?
There's
Is
this,
it like a full environment or like a...
it's like a bare bones version of an operating system. So for example, you can do Docker search Ubuntu, which is just a very common Linux distribution. And there's actually just one without a user called Ubuntu. You can kind of clips the screen on the back there. But what that downloads is what's called a chroot, but like a very fancy version of it. So it's basically just the bare bones operating system, and then the container engine starts a process that then can you explain this more? Chroot?
Yeah, so chroot is when you change the directory that your computer considers the base of your file system. And so your basically Linux is pretending that the root of whatever ISO image or other kind of image, such as Ubuntu, is pretending that the base of that file system, so where etc and where the user and home directories all are, that it's just acting as if that were the base of your current file system. So you just kind of get thrown in there, and Docker provides a somewhat secure environment for that to operate within.
Yeah, so basically it just starts a process and then tricks that process into thinking it's starting another operating system, even though it's really like not starting it. It's using the same Linux kernel you're running on your computer, or if you're, I think the Windows version of this actually downloads a VM to run things on top of. That may have changed. Windows has added some container support. It's not super elegant underneath, but on top it looks nice. So, does anyone have any other questions?
Could you post the slides to the Slack?
Yeah, so our slides are they should be available on our website, but also we record all our meetings, so this is available on our YouTube channel. So I can post the slides to Slack if you want them right now, though. Make it so people can honestly change things. So Slack. So these go right in general. So we have one more slide. So just a little bit more information on containers. The Kubernetes system is what most enterprise, like huge corporations, will try to use for containers. That doesn't have a lot of security built into it by default. Neither does default Docker, so there's a lot of money right now in being able to, like, basically wreck basically being able to wreck someone's container setup and then telling them how you did it in exchange for not like ransomware, but like as a professional security auditor. Containers can also run on virtual machines, so they're not exactly like exclusive technologies. What we're seeing right now is a lot of previously hosted on virtual machine web apps are being condensed into like tiny containers, and then a server that could run, say, 100 virtual machines is now running like 100,000 containers. Maybe not quite that many, but it's definitely like a huge increase in how much you can run when you don't have to emulate all the hardware on the system. There's another tool called Docker Compose, which if you've run the get Docker script, you should be able to apt show Docker Compose. So this is just basically the language and tool that lets you create Docker images through source code. It's pretty nice. It's weird syntax though, so it requires learning a little bit. And then containers can also X11 forward. So what that means is on Linux, your entire Windows system is called X11, or I guess there's also Wayland now, which means you can actually detach a window that's running on a remote computer and put it on your screen as if it's running on your system, but really the backend resources are another computer. So you can do that through containers. It's just a little bit more finicky, but you can also SSH into containers. So there's lots of new modern like security-based operating systems that are trying to basically use a Docker image every time they install a single application, which is a huge waste of disk resources, but also somewhat efficient. So, yeah.
Is there like a cyber memes page you get these from?
I put effort into it. Okay.
Oh, you make them?
No, I didn't make that one.
Okay.
No. Yeah, so the joke there is you can put, you can use Docker through LXC, which is Linux containers. And then KVM is a super fast virtualization module in the Linux kernel. So basically you can run a virtual machine at near real speed, and then through that you can run a Docker container at real near speed. So it just gets like progressively faster the farther down you go.
It should be noted that you can't run a Docker container or most containers as a full system. Don't try, because you'll run into a lot of issues.
Oh yeah, that's another thing. So Docker containers, they like are tricked to think they're full operating systems. They're really not. So if you try to do things like run services, you can encounter a lot of issues because they don't boot. They just like turn on. That's weird to explain, but
So it's like the services are actually normally just connected to something that's running and touching the kernel.
Yep.
And if there's no like kernel to touch, they're just kind of floating there, and services can't exist.
yeah. You can actually install systemd and like run services. It's just like really unhappy about running. So systemd is like the current de facto task scheduler for Linux distributions. So when you like turn on your computer, it starts systemd and that starts the rest of your operating system. But Linux containers don't quite work that way, so it gets really upset. Right. Does anyone have any other questions? So the vulnerability scan takes about 30 minutes to an hour to complete, which is not super fast, but there are fun things to look at. So there's a machine called Metasploitable, which is meant for you to practice getting good at Metasploit on. So Metasploitable, actually it is on SourceForge, which I think is weird because no one ever uses it anymore. It's just a virtual machine you can download and then set up. I probably should have scanned it before coming to this meeting, but I didn't quite have time. So it should have like probably at least 100 vulnerabilities on the current version. Have you scanned one yet?
I haven't scanned one for a couple months.
Yeah.
But there's like a ton.
Yeah, so these are meant for you to like just open Metasploit and just go to town on it. So. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Without any more questions, I don't have any more slides. So, thank you all for coming.
Awesome.